Bam.
I'm Allen Packwood.
And I'm Richard Dannatt, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Yes, I love it. Fellas, thank you so much for coming on the show. I've been listening to your incredible book. And so one of the things I'm fascinated by and why I'm desperate to talk to you all is that there's so much work to explain the totality of World War II. So I've had Gilles Milton on in the past, and I had him on, and he was talking about, for people watching, we were talking about the Office of Ungentlemanly Warfare, and they would invent all kinds of bombs, that kind of thing. And they helped the resistance. So when you talk about the resistance, you got to talk to Halleck Kochansky. And so I had Halleck on the show, and I had the two of them on the show. And this is the best part, was at the end of it, you know, Halleck's like, "Oh, Giz, will you be going to the London Library Christmas party?" And he's like, "I chair it. Of course I'll be there." And so they became friends, and they got to know each other. So that's just a little aside. But all of these details that you guys all write about and pack together, you know, we get way past just simply talking about then D-Day happened, and then the Battle of the Bulge happened, and then Hitler died. So thanks for what you guys are doing. Thanks for coming on the show. And I guess let's just start talking.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
I thought maybe somebody have something to say.
Okay. Well, I'm happy to start. So I'm Allen Packwood. I'm lucky enough to be the director of the Churchill Archives Centre at Churchill College in Cambridge, which houses the personal papers of Sir Winston Churchill. And I don't need to tell you or any of your listeners what a huge archive that is. Some 2,500 boxes, an estimated 1 million items, everything from Churchill's childhood letters and school reports through to his final writings. And I've been lucky enough to be working with this material now for some 28 and a half years. But one of the things that intrigued me was that, you know, when people think of Churchill, when they think of the Second World War, they think of 1940, and they think of his great speeches, blood, toil, tears and sweat. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. This was their finest hour. But they don't tend to think of D-Day. When you think of D-Day, you think of Tom Hanks, you think of Saving Private Ryan. It just got me thinking, well, why was this? And so that led me into sort of starting to research and to think about Churchill and D-Day. And then I was lucky enough to meet Richard, and Richard has a very specific connection to Normandy and D-Day.
Well, Alan, that's absolutely right. It's been a great privilege to work with you on this book. Winston Churchill actually has been my boyhood hero from as long as I can remember. History has always had a huge fascination for me, and not surprisingly, having had 40 years in the British Army and finishing as Chief of the Army Staff, Chief of the General Staff, as we call it over here in this country, it was great just to go through that whole career myself. But I think as far as Normandy is concerned, just take it back to some of the tactical detail. The only Victoria Cross, the only medal for the highest valour won by a member of the British Armed Forces, the British Army, on D-Day was by Company Sergeant Major Stan Hollis of 6th Battalion, the Green Hounds. And that's my regiment. So I feel a very close affinity to Stan Hollis, who won the only Victoria Cross on D-Day. And as it so happens, over the years, I have become the chair of the Normandy Memorial Trust, which over the last 10 years has placed a memorial in Normandy to the 22,442 servicemen and women under British command who lost their lives in the Normandy campaign. And that memorial sits just above Gold Beach, where 50th Division with Stan Hollis stormed ashore on the 6th of June, 1944. And then looking slightly to your left, as you look out to sea, you can see the Mulberry Harbour, Port Winston, which was one of the two Mulberry Harbours through which the logistics, the lifeblood of the campaign flowed. So when Alan and I put our heads together and said, well, what about a book about Churchill's D-Day? I said, yep, I'm right there with you. Let's get on with it.
It's such a big endeavor, and I wanted to go back to the archive piece because we continue to find some of these modern day archives of these incredible people recently had someone on the show who manages Ernest Hemingway's archives. You know, they had found a box of stuff at one of the restaurants he inhabited at in Key West. So you get these things, and you can go through every single piece of paper that's in there. And you talked about how many there were. It's crazy. When you see a speech, and you guys mentioned this in the book, you talk about one of the most important speeches is Churchill or his staff, are they thinking that this first draft that's not even been retyped into another draft, which is then, is he thinking about the fact that we're going to be talking about this 80 years later?
I'll jump in ahead of Alan there, because
please.
I make quite a lot of speeches, and sometimes people offer me drafts of speeches, but actually I prefer to do it for myself. And I think Churchill was an extraordinarily busy man, and yes, his staff were being helpful and they were offering him drafts, but actually he knew, rather as you're suggesting, that these words were important words. They were words of moment, they were words of history, and he wanted to get them right. And that's why we see the scratchings and the corrections and the writing out, and such wonderful documents in Alan's possession now in the archives.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just amplify that, I mean, I think what you have to remember about Churchill is that he was first and foremost a writer. He cared passionately about words. This is someone who made his name as a young war correspondent and soldier, sort of traveling around the British Empire, Cuba, and you just mentioned Ernest Hemingway, but he was there in Cuba. That's where he came under fire for the first time around the time of his 21st birthday in 1895. He's fighting on the Indian northwest frontier, and then in the Sudan and South Africa. And what's different about Churchill is that he writes up those experiences. He writes them up as newspaper articles. He writes them up as books, and he uses that not just to earn money, but to raise his profile. So words are used to launch his career. They underpin his career. And when it comes to Churchill's speeches in the Second World War, he knows how much is riding on them. He knows how important they are, how important it is to get the words right. So they are his own words. He doesn't rely on teams of speech writers. The way that Churchill would work is that he would dictate. There would be a duty secretary on call with a state-of-the-art silent typewriter to take down his words. And they would then type them out for him, first of all, in normal typescript, double-spaced. And he would then go through that typescript, as Richard's just said, making annotations, amendments, corrections. And sometimes with these speeches, you can see that they've been through several drafts. And you can literally see Churchill's thought process at work. And then the really interesting thing is that when the speech is more or less in its final format, it's taken away by that same duty secretary and it's retyped at a smaller size so that it will fit comfortably into his hand or pocket. And then it's set out on the page in a blank verse format, like poetry. And when you see it set out on the page like that, you can understand why he does it, because it gives him the rhythm, it gives him the emphasis, it gives him the pauses, but it also shows you, demonstrates how much work he puts into those speeches.
When I write about my combat experiences, my first pass, I'm an asshole. I'm direct. I'm very short. And if someone was to read my stuff 80 years later, be like, man, rough draft P is pretty hard on people. And so is there a similar process where like you have to get the words out and then they're there and then you massage in the message? And like you said, this is a performance, right? And so sometimes a word needs to be changed simply because it is cumbersome or doesn't flow. And then who has the command of Shakespeare and all the other things that he draws from? Is that him?
Well, you also have to remember, sorry, I don't know.
No, go on.
You have to remember that some of the words that we hear and have been passed down into history were originally spoken on the floor of the House of Commons in a debate, but then subsequently done again for radio. So there have been times when those around him have said, well, gosh, it wasn't quite as good as it was before. He was tired. In fact, he was smoking his cigar throughout, just revealing some of the pressure that he was under. But the words that Alan is saying really, really matter to him, and he thought about them very clearly. And I think, as you suggested, Pete, with an eye on history.
I mean, I think Churchill, famously said in the House of Commons in about 1948, I think it will be best for all parties to leave the past to history, especially as I propose to write that history myself. And of course he did. He did write his multi-volume history of the Second World War, which is one of the major sources for our book. He did seek to preserve this great archive, and he did know that his speeches would continue to be used and quoted. So he knew he was writing not just for the contemporary audience, but also for a future audience potentially. So he did go to enormous lengths to make sure that those words were right. And Richard is absolutely right that he also relished the performance aspect of this. It was the adrenaline that he got from standing in front of 400 fellow MPs in the House of Commons, or standing up in the Congress in December 1941 after Pearl Harbor, when he gives that amazing speech to the joint houses.
The whole thing, we kind of lose track of the fact that none of this was assured. I mean, there's definitely times when things didn't go well. We'll just say Dunkirk for one. But there are so many instances where one bullet, one decision, one bit of bravery changes completely everything. And so we lose track of the fact that it's a foregone conclusion that this was going to work. When did, like when Eisenhower writes his thing, like, hey, we're going to send all these guys over to D-Day. By the way, when it doesn't work, it's all my fault. I guess, where was Churchill when it comes to that kind of accountability? What were his thoughts about the operation? And then I really want to get into all of the egos that you have to manage in a joint combined operation like that before we'd even really studied joint combined operations. So I'll give the floor to you guys.
Well, there's one document, and I'll let Alan reveal that document, which just illuminates Winston Churchill's doubts and concerns on the eve of D-Day. And remember, casting back, yes, of course, we now know it was successful. But on the evening of the 5th of June, 1944, he had no idea what was going to be successful. And we'll come to what he said to his wife, Clemmy, in a moment, and I'll let Alan reveal that. But just
too kind. You should go for it.
No. But just go back to when Winston Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty and came up with the idea to knock Turkey out of the war through the Gallipoli campaign. That was a disaster. And that really played on his mind. Fast forward to early 1940, when he was again First Lord of the Admiralty, and there was this really good idea. Well, let's starve German industry of iron ore from Sweden. It passes through Norway, so let's mine the Norwegian waters, or even better, let's go and take the Norwegian ports. And it was a catastrophic disaster. So he's got these things in mind, and even the Anzio landings shortly earlier on in 1944. Instead of being a strike to Rome, it was a whale that was stranded on the sea. So these things are playing on his mind. So it's not surprising that he wrote a note to his wife on the evening of the 5th of June, which Alan will just talk about.
No, absolutely. So, I mean, you have to remember, I think, that up until 1942 and the end of 1942, the British and Churchill have really struggled in the Second World War. We've been driven out of Norway, we've been driven out of France, we've been driven out of Greece, we've been defeated in Singapore. And so, how could Churchill or any of the British chiefs of staff take D-Day for granted? And we can come back and talk about why that then impacts on their strategic decision making, and why it meant really that there was no possibility of going into France in 1942 and very little possibility of going in 1943, despite sort of Marshall's initial hopes to the contrary. But you're right. I mean, that level of doubt about this operation, when you're sending so many men into combat, remains right up until the last moment. And, Churchill is there. He's in his map room on the eve of D-Day. Obviously, sort of unable to go to bed, looking at the maps, going over the plans one more time. And Clementine Churchill joins him, and he turns to her and he says, "Do you realise that by the morning 20,000 men may have been killed?" So you can see there, you know, what he's wrestling with, and the pressure on all of those major commanders was immense, and those worries were shared by all of them. General Alan Brooke, the chief of the British Imperial General Staff, writes in his diary that, you know, this is one of the riskiest operations in the war, and he wishes it were over. Admiral Ramsey, who's commanding the naval operation, is equally worried, because they can't be certain how it's going to turn out, even after all of the preparation that they've undertaken.
And you have to also bear in mind that there were things even more recently that were playing on Churchill's mind. The Slapton Sands disaster, when the 4th US Division was rehearsing its landings subsequently on Utah Beach, and over 740 US servicemen, soldiers and sailors lost their lives in that rehearsal. So the prospect of this being a bloody disaster very much played on his mind. Happily, for US 4th Division, 197 servicemen were either killed or wounded on that day. That's 197 too many, but mercifully it was far less than the number that lost their lives at Slapton Sands.
Man, you just said a mouthful there. Oh my gosh, Richard, that, you know, here I live on the west coast of California, and just a little bit south of me, where I'll be later on today. You know, the Marines can't reliably put an armored vehicle with Marines inside of it and keep it on top of the ocean today. Now you go back, I mean, gosh, 80 years, but probably equipment that's 90 years old a lot of times. It is remarkable that, again, we managed to pull this off. And for sure, like we've been discussing in the last few minutes, not a sure thing. There are so many things. And you look at all the individual histories, not just the paratroopers, but the pathfinders that go in ahead of time. And they are like, I'm here, now what am I going to do? The plan is all shot to hell. You're relying on these young people to make a difference, to get back to light the way, whatever it is. There are so many things that even today would be extraordinarily hard to get done. And it is a marvel that it does get done. I wanted to ask about, you know, D-Day almost starts the day before, but weather precludes it. How does Churchill deal with that weather delay? Because that, again, you can't go when the weather's not right, but oh my gosh, the stress of those 24 hours.
Well, I think you actually you raise a really good point, because you can do all the most fantastic planning in the world, and let's face it, the combined services staff had planned Overlord down to the finest detail, but then who is the overlord of Overlord? Actually, it's God Almighty, and the weather just was not right. And you know, the plan was to go on the 5th, and frankly, if he hadn't gone the next day on the 6th, it would have been a delay for another 2 weeks, when the tides and the moons wouldn't have been quite right. The chances of keeping the operation secure were much reduced. And don't forget, deception and the security of the operation was really important. But then there was this window of opportunity that Group Captain Stagg, poor man, wretched man. I mean, I'm a bit of a weather buff, but frankly, to have to call the decision, actually, you know, say to Eisenhower, you can go, and they went. So you're absolutely right to ask the question. But you know, where was Churchill during that period? Well, he was somewhere you wouldn't have expected him to be. Alan, I'll tell you.
Okay, absolutely. So, I mean, what Churchill decided to do was to actually abandon the sort of command centre in London and actually travel down to the south coast on his personal train, so that he could be as near the action as possible. And actually, as he travelled down in his train, he was hoping to go even further. He actually wanted to accompany the troops across the Channel on D-Day. And he'd asked Admiral Ramsey to draw up a plan, which, you know, Admiral Ramsey then had to do. And the plan would have seen Churchill embarking on HMS Belfast on D-1, and then crossing the channel, and if it was safe to do so, transferring to a destroyer for a tour of the beaches. Now, Ramsay drew up the plan, but of course he didn't like it. The last thing that any of the military commanders wanted was the British Prime Minister anywhere near the action. It was a huge added burden and distraction for them, potentially. So, of course, Ramsay informs Eisenhower. Eisenhower tries to talk Churchill out of it, but Churchill tells Eisenhower that actually Eisenhower has no control over the personnel of Her Majesty's ships. And if he's appointed to one of His Majesty's ships, then he can be there. But of course, the one person who can stop Churchill potentially is the king. And it takes 2 handwritten letters from the king. The first written out on the 31st of May, the second as late as the 2nd of June, and delivered to Churchill on the south coast by dispatch rider, before Churchill grudgingly defers to His Majesty's wishes and agrees he can't go. Now, obviously, it was madness really to have the Prime Minister contemplating crossing the channel, and his staff were all opposed to the idea, and were equally opposed to the idea of him being in a train down on the south coast, which had basically one line to the outside world. So there was Churchill in a sleepy siding in Droxford in Hampshire, demanding to speak to the president, demanding to speak to the combined chiefs of staff. Fortunately, one good thing about the delay was it meant that he had no choice but to go back to London. So actually on D-Day itself, he was back in London, and he was able to go and address the House of Commons at noon as the first news of the landings came in. Which
was where, of course, he should be constitutionally. And I think the other thing that's interesting about that speech, that intervention that he made in the House of Commons, was that the first thing he talked about was the fall of Rome the previous day under Field Marshal Alexander. And this was actually very important for Churchill, because he'd been a great advocate of holding off the Second Front in Europe until the time was right, and a proponent of sweeping the Germans and the Italians off the North African desert, moving into Sicily, moving up to Italy, moving through Italy. And therefore, quite rightly, he drew attention to the great feat of arms, critically under British command. And he was very keen to make that point. This was under British command, that Rome had fallen and the campaign was moving. Oh, and almost by the way, the D-Day landings have begun under General Eisenhower, led by General Montgomery. And well, it's early days yet, and I'll come back to the house later on and I'll tell you how it's going. But so far, it looks going pretty well. But the big thing was he'd majored on the fall of Rome first, and then he kept the house in suspense, actually, like a great House of Commons actor would have done. That, and what you're waiting for is, actually, Overlord's going quite well.
It's partly drama, but it is also partly that he wanted to emphasize for as long as possible the equality of the British effort with the American effort. And also, of course, he knew that if D-Day was successful, that more and more resources were going to go into France. And while Churchill was not opposed to the French landings per se, while he supported the D-Day landings, I think he still believed that it was better to be fighting on multiple fronts, and that it was important to be fighting in Italy, particularly with one eye to the post-war situation. And the fact that, there was now a risk of Russia moving into Eastern Europe, Russia moving into the Balkans. And from Churchill's perspective, that was very much a threat to British dominance in the Mediterranean. So I think he also had one eye to the future.
I'm thinking, so let's say that Churchill does decide to go. Who speaks politically to the nation while he's off, invading things? And I'm thinking about Ted Roosevelt Jr., who wins a Medal of Honor, our highest award for valor. And he basically runs up and down the beach directing things, because he's like, I'm going to die from a heart attack in a month anyhow. So let's just do this thing, right? And so it is powerful to have someone there like that. But what happens if Churchill is killed, if he does go, and who's speaking while he, who's doing his job when he's out doing that, if he doesn't heed the king's word, or I never met a writer, and he takes off.
Right, shall I come in here, Richard?
You're first.
I mean, I think, I mean, this is exactly one of the issues and why it was clearly impossible for Churchill to go. I mean, I think the answer to that under the Constitution is that it would have fallen on Churchill's deputy prime minister, Clement Attlee, the leader of the Labour Party, to speak in the House, or perhaps the Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden. Churchill, when he went abroad, when he travels over to the United States, or when he goes to the Middle East or the Soviet Union, he will normally tell the king that if anything happens to me, because of course international travel in those days was so dangerous. You're traveling, across enemy-infested waters sometimes, and you're flying in sort of and planes where if they go above 15,000 feet, you need oxygen. So, I mean, he would normally set in place some sort of mechanism for who would replace him if something happened to him. And I think it's interesting here. Churchill falls very ill in North Africa after the Tehran conference in December 1943. And he actually comes close to death, which is something that was sort of obviously kept from the British public at the time. And one of the things that he says to his daughter Sarah, who's now nursing him, is, "It doesn't matter if I die now. All of the plans have been made." And there is a part of Churchill, I think, the part of Churchill that admires Nelson and Wolfe and these other great leaders, who almost wants to go out at that moment of history. He certainly wants to be a participant in the great moments of history.
Anything on that, Richard?
I completely agree with what Alan said. I mean, Churchill is so much part of British history, so much part of international history, but actually he knew it and he lived it, and he wanted to be that right from when he was a young man. And he got himself involved in the Boer War. He got himself taken to Cuba. He joined. I mean, he just had a sense of history. He loved history, and I think he also loved life. I mean, certainly enjoyed living life. I mean, the things that he consumed and the things that he did, the cigars he smoked, the champagne he drank, the brandy that he drank. I mean, he certainly enjoyed living life. But rather, as Alan said, if he had died at that moment of history, or if he died at the moment of making history, knowing that the future was secure, I think he would have felt that actually his path to glory had street lining by the Brigadier Guards would have been completely secure, and that his place in history was secure, as it is, of course, in the fullness of his life and the fullness of his dying. And I can remember as a schoolboy watching his funeral on television. His place in history was revered and absolutely secure. Probably the greatest British person of certainly his century, maybe the greatest British person that there's been. But I'm now just reflecting on that and just thinking who the other candidates might be. But certainly Winston Churchill was up there amongst the greatest, and he knew it. And he knew it.
There's a wonderful quote by Churchill from an Edwardian dinner party where he meets Violet Asquith, the daughter of the then Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith. And he says to her, "My dear, we are all worms, but I do believe that I am a glowworm." And I think that captures something of Churchill's sort of self-belief and belief in his own destiny.
Yeah. We lose track, or we're not aware. And whenever I read these books, it's just always so powerful to think, man, it's so much more complex than I ever realized. And like, I've been to war, I know how complex this stuff is and how dangerous and risky. But the whole interplay between France and what will France be on the backside of the war, because this is a totally different part of the game. And it's I don't know, it's all, political and strategic and all that up there, but it's not in the same channel as we got to get on the continent and go get the beaten up on the Germans. So talk a little bit about what Churchill's role is pre-D-Day in dealing with France.
Well, I think it's almost bigger than France. I think it's really how Churchill saw Britain's position in the world during the war and after the war. But bear in mind, when the British Army was defeated in France in May and June 1940, and Britain just avoided being defeated by the Royal Air Force winning the Battle of Britain and Hitler deciding not to attack Britain. Britain was standing alone. Britain was a remaining shining beacon of democracy and freedom around which the rest of the world could rally. And going beyond that, of course, Winston Churchill felt very much, as the King's principal minister, that he was responsible for the British Empire. He was responsible for Britain's position in the world, stretching through the Middle East. We still had the mandate for Palestine, into Egypt. We had responsibility for India. We had very close ties with Australasia and with Canada. He saw himself, and indeed he said at a speech in the Mansion House in 1942, "I haven't become the King's minister to preside over the dissolution of the British Empire." So he felt very strongly that he was carrying the flame for Britain and for her empire, however anachronistic that might now seem to us. And so you then put that wider set of thoughts into his relationship with France, and he loved the French. I mean, when he flew back and forth to France during the battle for France in 1940, he just couldn't believe when he asked, where are your reserves? Kuhn, the master maneuver, is not here. He couldn't believe that the French hadn't got the ability to maneuver a reserve force to hold the Germans and stop what was going to happen. He loved the French. But of course he had a problem, because actually he didn't get on very well with Charles de Gaulle, who saw himself as the leader of the Free French. And going back to what Alan was saying earlier about the awkward couple of days in the train in the siding at Droxford, to lunch one day came General de Gaulle, and that was not a very happy lunch at all, and in a sense set back the relationship with France. But I'll turn over to Alan in a moment. But the other thing which is really important about Churchill strategically, he was thinking beyond the end of the war. He was thinking towards what became the Cold War. He was watching the advance of Stalin's Red Army as it swept across Europe to the point where, when they stopped, that's where the Iron Curtain effectively came down. So he was thinking not just about today, but he was very much thinking about tomorrow and worrying about it.
Absolutely. And let me just sort of pick up on a few things there and dig into that sort of Churchill, de Gaulle, Churchill and France relationship. I mean, I think the Churchill and de Gaulle relationship is a really interesting one. In one way, in many ways, they were very, very different. I mean, you've got Churchill, who's short and very animated and very voluble. You've got de Gaulle, who's very tall and taciturn. But where they're similar is in that they come to embody the national honor of their two countries. And I think although they quarreled endlessly, and Churchill gets absolutely furious with de Gaulle just before D-Day, although they quarrel, I think underneath there is this sort of grudging admiration for what each one represents. But Churchill on the Sunday before D-Day, so on the 4th of June, basically has to tell de Gaulle over Sunday lunch that the D-Day landings are going to happen, and it ends up in a massive row, because of course de Gaulle is very concerned that if the Allies go into France, that it's his Free French committee that actually controls the civilian administration in France. And that's something that Roosevelt in particular is not prepared to recognize. He's not yet prepared to recognize de Gaulle as the provisional government of France. And Churchill finds himself caught in the middle of this, caught between de Gaulle and Roosevelt, his two allies. And the big argument ensues, and according to de Gaulle's memoirs, what Churchill ultimately says is that if I have to choose between you and the Atlantic, or between you and Roosevelt, I'm always going to choose to support the United States. And of course, that you could argue that argument, that decision, that statement by Churchill potentially has huge ramifications for the post-war world, because of course it's certainly not forgotten by de Gaulle, who then, of course, vetoes Britain's early attempts to join the European Economic Community, partly as a result. And in a way, it sets up a dilemma which has been faced by all British prime ministers since Churchill about actually where does Britain sit in relation to the United States and to Europe. Churchill's answer, I think, would have been that actually Britain's power and influence in the world derived from sitting at the middle of three overlapping circles. And those circles were the British Empire, which of course was already diminishing by this point, Europe, and the United States. And that, you know, we derive our power and influence in the world from sitting at the focal point of those three circles. So, you know, he's certainly wrestling with that dilemma on the eve of D-Day. The other dilemma that he's wrestling with, which is covered in the book, is what the effect of the Allied bombing campaign in advance of the D-Day military operation is actually going to do to French civilian morale and French public opinion. And Churchill is really concerned in the weeks prior to D-Day that the bombing of French marshalling yards, railway yards, which is part of the bombing campaign, will actually result in thousands of French civilian deaths, and that to his mind this might actually create a dull hatred of the Allies amongst the French population, which in turn would then stop them from supporting the Allied operation when it comes, and coming back to Richard's point, might also turn the French population towards communism in the post-war world. So I think what you see there is that he's having to wrestle not just with the military operation, but also with these very complex political and diplomatic issues.
Yeah, everybody who's listening. Oh, go ahead.
The ultimate irony of what Alan has just said about Churchill's dilemma about whether he should support the switch of the heavy bombing campaign to be against marshalling yards and railways because he was concerned about French civilians, when in fact the development of Montgomery's Overlord plan was rather slower than it might have been, and Culled became a problem, a nut that really had to be cracked. He had to go along with the fact that Culled was very heavily bombed and a very large number of French civilians lost their lives, which is why, fast forward to the last few years, when, as I was saying earlier, we put the British National Memorial at Vers-sur-Mer overlooking Gold Beach and the Mulberry Harbour, we made sure that there was a very appropriate and special commemoration memorial to the French civilians who lost their lives, because, you know, loss of life in war by anybody at any stage is terrible. But when you've got civilians in a country that's being liberated that have to die in their tens of thousands, that's an absolute tragedy. And that felt very, very upsetting to Churchill, and quite rightly so too.
Did you have something else on that at all, Alan? No, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, it's you know, but it's interesting. It's an often overlooked part of this story, and it did actually dominate discussions in the British War Cabinet and Defence Committee in the weeks leading up to D-Day. I wanted to let everybody know we're talking to Allen Packwood and Richard Dannatt, and they've written an incredible book about D-Day and how it belongs to Winston Churchill, which is just fascinating to read all of the different little pieces of this. So yeah, sure, the battle happens, but all of the things that lead up to this point in time for Churchill, it's great. Here's the link down below. You can look and see down there in the comments. You know what I always say, buddy, read it, buy two, get one for your friend, and read this book. If you love World War II history, if someone in your family does, Father's Day is coming up, shoot, get this book. I'm telling you right now, I am having a blast reading it. I'm learning so much about something that I thought I knew a lot about, but apparently I don't know the first thing, because these guys have really done a great job researching. So we started to kind of touch on this topic, and it's so
it's so fresh today. Matter of fact, I think even today the IDF has released their casualty numbers in terms of what they've done in their fight with Hamas. And so when you think about Churchill, you just recently mentioned the French citizens, and there's always going to be civilian casualties. Oh, and by the way, Jeffress and his whole crew with all of this, ungentlemanly warfare, this often means whole villages getting targeted. And there are so many things that happen. There's a British citizen who, not sorry, I should say Australian citizen who ends up on the continent before the war. And he gets trapped there because a girl and love, and all of a sudden he ends up in the resistance. His name is Bruce Dowding. His grandson is Peter Dowding, who was someone of note in Australia. All these things go into this, right? Like we talked about all this big stuff, France and Russia and everything else, but there's Bruce Dowding on the ground out there in the resistance, and that has to weigh. As much as Churchill loves bombs made out of condoms and breath mints, there is a cost for all of this stuff, and that must be heavy. And so I guess, what are your guys' thoughts on civilian casualties and how Britain and the United States et al. Work to deal with the war and the obvious and unavoidable cost of civilian deaths?
Well, I mean, from a military point of view, it has to be accepted by any responsible commander that civilian deaths must be kept to the absolute minimum. You can't keep them to zero. That's just not the way the world works. And of course, this was brought home as we were talking just a few minutes ago about the Allied bomber campaign in Germany. Yes, it was a legitimate set of targets to go for the industrial heartland of Germany, to destroy their industrial capacity so that they didn't have tanks, fighters, and all the rest of it. But of course, everybody had to accept that a large number of civilians were going to be killed. And of course, this translates across to every military campaign. And I think you touched on it a moment ago. The Israelis in Gaza at the present moment. Then you start to get into the theoreticals of war, the just war theory, which basically comes down to two questions. Are we right to fight? And are we fighting right? Well, I think as far as the Israelis are concerned, yes, they were right to fight. They were attacked. But are they fighting right? Well, the jury's out as far as that's concerned.
Yeah, right, jury's out.
And of course, I think you have to come back to it as far as the Second World War is concerned. A very, very large number of German civilians, we've talked about French civilians as well, but very large number of German civilians lost their lives in the nighttime bombing by RAF Bomber Command and the daytime bombing by United States Army Air Force. But, it was argued that this was the way to do it. Morally, it is better to argue that we will destroy their industrial capacity. Morally, it is less good to argue that we will destroy their morale. And I think, again, go back to the Ukraine campaign of the last 2 or 3 years. If Putin wanted to break the Ukrainians' people's morale by destroying their power stations and by destroying, it doesn't work like that. People under attack, they tend to respond in a Dunkirk spirit way. Actually, they take the view, we're not going to be pushed around by someone else. So the moral argument is very weak about we'll destroy their will to carry on. It is more acceptable to talk about we'll destroy their industrial capacity. But at the end of the day, military commanders have an absolute obligation, certainly now under international law, to conduct their operations minimizing civilian casualties.
I think if you look at the Second World War, you can see Churchill wrestling with these issues at various times. At the height of the bombing campaign of Germany, he does draft a memo to the chiefs of the air staff where he questions the bombing policy and asks, effectively, have we gone too far? Are we beasts? But he's balancing that against the need to bring the war to an end as quickly as possible, because that is ultimately how you're going to reduce casualties and suffering. I think for me it's sort of summed up by the little dictum that he prints at the front of all 6 volumes of his history of the Second World War, where he writes out, in war resolution, in victory, magnanimity; in defeat, defiance; in peace, goodwill. And that's really the way that Churchill operated. As a war leader, he would use all of the weapons at his disposal to end the war as quickly as possible, because otherwise his view was that if we didn't use those weapons, the enemy would develop them, and they would use them. But as soon as you've got peace, then it's changing, and he's looking to limit the suffering. The other thing I would say is that we tend to think of Churchill as a warlord, but actually, he is working within the constraints of the British parliamentary system, the democratic system, and he always takes that extremely seriously. So throughout the Second World War, he is reporting regularly to the Houses of Parliament and giving them updates on the war situation. He is also ensuring that all of these big decisions, like the debates on the bombing of France or Germany, are being debated in the British War Cabinet, so that you do have political oversight and comment feeding into the military decision making. Would you say that's fair, Richard?
I would. I was just also going to say that the moral dilemma, of course, was very much there throughout. And one of the facets of D-Day and the Overlord campaign was that almost as soon as it began, the German V1 and V2 campaign against the UK began. The V1 was bad enough because they were like sort of today's drones, and you could kind of hear them coming. But the V2 was a supersonic weapon that just arrived with a huge amount of explosive. So if Churchill had agonized over the ethics and the morality of bombing German cities, in a sense, he took a bit of comfort by the fact that actually Hitler was using these super weapons against him. Of course, we all know how the Second World War ended, that if you're worried about the moral appropriateness of using massive weapons of mass destruction, of course, the war against Japan ended in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, when the two atomic bombs caused enormous destruction, which of course plays into the whole debate about the morality of warfare that's resonated on from those days in 1945.
And specifically on the stuff that, Jefferson, his crew, the SOE, SOI, those folks opt in and they parachute in, but when they go blow up the Peugeot plant or whatever it's going to be that happens, and that next village, right or wrong, that was them or not, right? The Germans come and they wacko an entire village off the map or kill every man in it. These things, gosh, I mean, it's a cost of war, but it is awfully hard to justify. And it has to be that people like Churchill, I know I've got my own people, that just sit on my shoulders in my dreams, and I have to account for the decisions that either I was compelled to make or that I made myself because of the situation I was in.
Well, I think as we're saying, I think Churchill felt these things very strongly. We've talked about his feelings about France in 1940. We've talked about his feelings towards French civilians over the bombing campaign. And, and an extent, the extent to which he felt about German civilians through the bombing of cities. I mean, the big raids on Dresden and other places. I mean, they were horrific. So I think there is very much the human side of Churchill, and of course we see it then parochially, his concern going back to Gallipoli, going back to the Norway campaign, that Clemmy, by tomorrow morning when he wake up, 20,000 young men could be dead. He felt very much, I think, as a democratic politician, about the sanctity of human life, and you must do everything you possibly can to preserve it.
There is another sort of side to Churchill here, which is that there was nothing he admired more than military bravery. I remember having a conversation with his daughter, his youngest daughter, Mary Soames, and the conversation turned to, did she think her father had any regrets? I think his main regret was probably that he didn't that his father had not lived longer to see him sort of make something of himself. But I think another one would have been that that he didn't win the Victoria Cross or the Military Cross. He always had the greatest admiration for those people who did, and he took a very, very keen interest in these military operations. He made himself not just Prime Minister, but also Minister of Defence, so that the Chiefs of Staff were reporting into him on a regular basis. He makes it very clear that his premiership, his leadership, is not just going to be about running the political strategy, but is also going to be oversight of the military strategy as well. And he takes a huge amount of interest in the plans and the deception plans and in the practical preparations that are being made for D-Day. And I think one of the things that often gets forgotten again here is the convening power of the Prime Minister. What Churchill is able to do at key moments in the planning for D-Day is to bring together the relevant civilian and military authorities and to knock heads together to actually get things done.
No, I love it. I love that you brought that up, because I'm always fascinated when you go through archives, the letter that you pull out and you read, and this person just popped, like right here. Here's some of my grandfather's World War II letters to his wife. He was a fighter pilot in the Pacific. And these moments come to life where someone named Don pops in, and you're like, who is Don? And then Don has this hyper short part of the story, but he influences the decision of whoever's going to be Churchill, whatever it is. So there must be these moments, these places that they don't hold enough weight to be in the story. But if they didn't come at that time, maybe different decisions are made. So who popped up in your guys' work where you're like, this is amazing, can't get distracted by that, but we're going to remember that, because if you don't write about it now, it could be that no one ever writes about that person.
Well, I think that's one of the things that's fun, and I'll let Alan talk about a couple. One of the things that's fun about the book is actually the way various people pop up throughout it. I mean, at the start, slightly selfishly, I talked about Company Sergeant Major Stan Hollis winning the only Victoria Cross for the British Army on D-Day. Yeah. But Stan Hollis was there at Dunkirk. Stan Hollis was there in the Western Desert. Stan Hollis was there in Sicily. Stan Hollis was there throughout the story. And there are others who pop up throughout the story. Alan, you want to talk about that wonderful...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what we wanted to emphasize was, firstly, of course, that, D-Day is the sum of so many individual contributors at all of these different levels, from sort of Churchill and Roosevelt and Allenbrook and Marshall at the top, right down to the not just the people who are storming ashore, but the people who are supporting them, the people who are building the synthetic harbors, and the people who are sort of making sure that the armies are supplied, the people who are actually doing all of the deception plans. There are, D-Day is the culmination of an enormous amount of planning and preparation by a huge number of people. And we wanted to make that very clear in the book. And we try and do that by following just a few individuals and showing how the decisions taken by Churchill and others then impact on them and on their lives. And, so Richard has mentioned Stan Hollis, but just to pick up on a couple of others, there is a young woman called Joan Bright, who is clearly an extremely able administrator. And she is sort of picked up by General Ismay, who is Churchill's chief of staff. And she ends up finding herself right in the center of the war planning and the war effort, and effectively makes herself indispensable, creating the filing system that they're all using. And by the end of the war, she's actually traveling out to these big wartime conferences like Yalta to actually organize the British delegations there. And when she goes out to Yalta and meets the Soviets, they're initially unwilling to take her seriously because she doesn't have a military rank. So she declares herself a major general. and she's then taken seriously. Incredible woman. I was lucky enough to know her a little bit at the very end of her life. She's credited as being one of the inspirations for James Bond's Moneypenny. But absolutely amazing woman who has this incredible career during the war. So that's just one story, and you follow her through.
Yeah.
Another would be the American paratrooper T.L. Rogers, who fights his way through sort of North Africa and Italy, and ends up as one of those pathfinders that you mentioned, going into Normandy. And unfortunately, he's killed. Now, I was just lucky enough to come across his story through meeting a member of his family, Professor Russell Riley of the University of Virginia, who was visiting the Churchill Archives Centre. I said I was writing a book on D-Day, and he said, "Oh, well, one of my relatives was involved. Let me tell you his story." And I thought we should include it. So, but there are so many of those D-Day stories out there.
Sorry, I had a little glitch on the Wi-Fi side. Yeah, I love it, and I love all of these little stories that do get to come to life. And T.L. Rogers, whoever else it's going to be, I appreciate you guys doing the work. Hey, we're just about at an hour. I don't want to keep you guys too long, and I have thoroughly enjoyed talking about this, and I'm really loving the book. What do you guys want to close with, and then we'll get out of here. And just a reminder, everybody, if you look in the remarks, there is the link down below. You can get the book right there, and like I said, always buy two, because that's great for these guys. All right. So to wrap this thing up, Allen, Richard, what are your thoughts?
Well, Alan's in the archives, so I'll go first and then let him add a bit of detail that he might want to add. I think the big thing, the great thing about Churchill is the enormousness of his character and his strategic grasp. Yes, he was there at Gallipoli. Yes, he was there in 1940. Yes, he was very significant, but perhaps under-recognized. And what our book is trying to do is to change that around Overlord and D-Day. But he had this world vision, this world perspective. As Alan talked about, the three circles that he saw Great Britain and himself in the center of that center circle as being very much part of. So he looked back, he enjoyed the moment, but actually he felt he had a role to play in the development of the world after the World War, after the Second World War was over, and being a great Brit, Britain's position in it, but never forgetting that he was half American, and that he may have loved France. He was a Brit, but actually he felt very, very close to the United States. And go back to that comment about choosing between de Gaulle and France and America. Actually, it would be America first. And I think that's quite an important point that actually resonates down the years in the relationship between the United Kingdom, even today, and the United States of America.
Love it.
It's very, very, very hard to follow that. But I would say that for me, and coming back to the sort of motivation for writing this book, most of the time when people think about Churchill, they think about 1940. When you think about Churchill, you tend to think about Gary Oldman and Darkest Hour, the movie. You don't think about Churchill in connection with Saving Private Ryan and 1944. And actually, I think you need to, if you're looking at Churchill's leadership during the Second World War, you need to see the totality of that leadership, and the role that he plays in 1944 for D-Day is in many ways a very different role. He's not at the center of events in the way that he is in 1940. He's not the mouthpiece for events, but he's playing a hugely important role behind the scenes in developing the strategy, in steering through the preparations that ultimately deliver victory on the beaches and therefore bring an end to the war in Europe. And I felt that it was important that we put some spotlight on that. Of course, it's not always an easy relationship with the United States. And I think many of your listeners will be interested in sort of reading in the book about many of the sort of arguments and discussions that take place about strategy. But I think one of the great achievements, to echo what Richard's just said, in the Second World War was forging this unity at the top between the British and the Americans and the combined chiefs of staff. And it's that has to be tested in North Africa and Italy, but it's that ultimately delivers victory in 1944.
And let's just not forget, if England under Churchill had not stood in 1940, such that America and American troops were able to come to Britain and take part in the Second Front in D-Day in 1944, with the Russians coming across Europe, if we had not defeated Nazism and fascism in Europe, Europe and the world would have looked a very different place today. Churchill has an absolutely cornerstone position in history in 1940 and in 1944.
I love it. I love it. All right, let me roll these credits and I'll say goodbye to you guys proper like after the show. I'll be right back. Bye-bye, everybody else.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much.